Hello, everyone.
Hi, David.
How are we all doing today? Good. So there are a few things that are up on Brightspace. One is if the movie paper, the film paper is something that you want to do, the information about that is listed in there under one of those sections. I will have a rubric there. The big thing to remember is it is one of your options. You don't have to do it, but it may be a viable option for you in this process. Also, so you know, midterm is not next week, but will be the week after that. It will not be in class. It will be an online midterm, and usually I give about 5 days. They'll put it up. So if you're feeling like you want to get it done, you certainly can. If you don't want to do it right at that time, you'll have a certain window of opportunity to do it. The only thing about the midterm to know structurally is that there will be an essay. You will receive a prompt before that, right? I'll send you the prompt for anybody who wants to do it. And then the essay needs to be submitted via email. Some people try to send it through Brightspace, and I don't like Brightspace yet for submissions. And it is just as easy in most cases to send me an email for that, but that will all be written out. Hold on a second. The last thing about the midterm is you don't have to tell me you're doing the midterm. You may wake up one day and just be like, oh my gosh, I need to just do this midterm. And that's fine, because you have so many options for achieving your grade. We can keep an eye throughout the course of the semester as to what you need. That's why we do those syllabi. That's why we do all that stuff. Sound good? Awesome. Michaela, you had a question.
So, but if we're doing something like the film paper, we don't have to worry about the midterm?
Only if you're going to do the film paper and the midterm for your grade. You have 5 options of what you can do for your grade. Out of those, you have to pick 3. So you get to pick whatever you want to do. Most people find that the midterm is the easiest way to get something under your belt. But if you are just super busy right now, I want to give you the opportunity that you can hold off and sort of schedule that out. So take a look at the syllabus to figure out what things are going to work best for you. Okay, cool. Okay, so today, hopefully you had a chance to read the lecture, and this is a very exciting, complicated, awful, fabulous, scary, joyous time. The thing that I always want you to remember about this period is it was summed up perfectly by Charles Dickens in the book. What book? Come on.
Moby Dick.
No,
No.
Charles Dickens. I know, but you don't offer. You don't offer information if you don't know what the question is. No? No. Tale of Two Cities. It is the perfect thing to think about when we're talking about this period for a couple reasons. First of all, what's the very first famous line of A Tale of Two Cities? Exactly. And it also gives us the spirit of what we're thinking about. What are the two cities that the Tale of Two Cities is about? You probably have a 50-50 chance of guessing at least one.
London.
Okay, that wouldn't have been the first one. Think about the lecture.
Paris.
Exactly. It's about Paris. It's about London. What are the challenges through the idea of that? And I like you to think of that for this period because it is not officially a Victorian costume history period. We kind of do Rococo and then magically Regency, right? And I put this in because it is perhaps, I don't have data for this, but it is perhaps one of the most important movements to change fashion history because of the situation that's happening in Paris and in France. and the situation that is happening in England and how England is viewed, that the whole thing kind of gets all messed up. And we're really talking about 1774. Now, again, remember, dates aren't as important as big ideas. So, but about 1774, when Marie Antoinette comes to France through to the French Revolution, with tucked in there the American Revolution, then compounding with the sort of redevelopment of France after the French Revolution, where everything is chaos. And if you thrive on chaos, right? If you are I don't know my Dungeons and Dragons squares very well, chaotic evil, maybe, this would fall in that category because it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. And anything can happen. And it's sometimes in our little Victorian minds, we want order for this period. And it's almost impossible for me to say, here's the mathematical order of how everything works. We kind of have to expect that everything I'm talking about today is put into a big box and just kind of doing this. And after about 30 years, sorry, for those of you at home, I am shaking. I don't know if you can see me, but shaking my hands in this big box. And then all of a sudden, about 1809, the box goes, and it's like, and here we are in the Regency, you know, it's crazy. And we're going to see so many things, especially when we get to the slideshow, that contribute to this, that there's almost no formal or formative idea that you can actually fully hang your hat on. If you remember from the lecture, there were two words that I used, les incroyables and les merveilleuses, which are the incredible ones and the miraculous ones or the marvelous ones, which were young people who dressed very extensively. We'll come back to them. But my teachings and my research are very different than sometimes what these books say, because these books want to tell you one thing about these to make it really super clear, but it's not. It's almost not even a word that you can define with like a sentence and a half, because there's so many other things that go into it. So we have to be really careful. If you notice, also, very few terms in this period, right? And in fact, I'm going to say exactly the term that you kind of need to remember the most from this period, which almost has nothing to do with it, because it's helping us get to Jane Austen land. But if we think about where we left, for those of you at home, I'm pointing to our Gone à la Française, where we left, it's hard to imagine the qualities of Jane Austen from that Regency. It almost doesn't make sense. This is what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to get to that today, okay? So the first thing we're going to do, like we always do, look at bad drawings. Then we're going to look at some clothes in the room. And then finally, we'll do some slideshow. But a lot of it is, again, narrative. These aren't necessarily notes you have to write down and remember, but hopefully it'll help clear it out, because it doesn't quite make as much sense as sometimes it's easy to see. And we're going into a century where everything makes sense. Everything has a reference, everything is specific, and it's part of the mise en scène of that period, you know? Okay. So, they are. But what we see are the styles moving and living together in harmony that don't want to live together in harmony. Remember when I told you in the Rococo that at some point, if you happen to be in your Wayback Machine and could get to the years, 1760, you would see a sack gown, a Française, and an Anglaise all together in a room. It could happen. we have a very similar idea here, but a lot of it is based on the mentality or the idea of the person itself. So I have listed, and for those of you at home, you'll see right next to the gentleman, I have listed this franglaise. That's the word that I call this gown, right? It's not an official. If you typed in franglaise into Google search, you'd probably get a movie or you'd get some sort of like thing about language. That is not a gown that exists, but I use it as this general idea of a pinched waist and panniers, right? The silhouette, I'm sort of, because we can't spin it around. We can't figure out what's going on there. So I'm just calling it for that. There are people who will continue to wear this all the way into the beginning of the next period, into the Regency, and in certain situations may wear it even farther because it's considered to be proper. We may have that in our lives. Like maybe we have a grandmother who wears dresses, we might say, that feel of another time, but they have determined that this is what you wear for this situation. Does that make sense? So it feels so out of date, and you're like, Grandma, 1973, I can tell. However, it doesn't matter because it coexists. Now, you may be eyeing it because you're like, this is awesome, right? But at this time, it's not so much, and we'll talk about why, because it is very visible. But what we see is, especially with Marie Antoinette coming. Now, we have to also understand Marie Antoinette. Has anybody ever seen the movie Marie Antoinette?
The 2006 one?
2006, yeah. It's a really swell movie with the exception of like 3.5 things. But that's my own issue because it tried to prepare me for one thing and then it lied to me, but then it tried to do it again. And I was like, no, no, no. However, overall, historically, it's probably an incredible idea of what her life was like. And one of the most important things that if you ever get a chance to see it, and I do recommend that you watch it, not only because it's fantastic to visually look at, it's also exceptionally good acting-wise, is this idea that, Marie Antoinette from Austria, she gets in a carriage, she has all of her, Austrian, I almost said Australian, completely different world. Austrian accoutrement on. She's all dressed up to meet her, new husband at the age of 14. And the minute she gets to the French border, they have set up a temple, basically. And she gets out of her carriage and she has to change physically everything she is wearing and everything that she knows to become French. And she also has to give up her dog. She has to give up everything that is in her life to become French. And a lot of that is through this idea of dressing. In fact, they strip her naked of everything that she has. And this is, we're talking like a temporary, gorgeous thing that they're going to rip down in about 4.5 minutes. But this ceremony is so important that she is now a representation of France. And they basically strip her naked and then redress her and put her in a new carriage. And her dog, I don't know what happens to it. I think they kill it, make something up. No, they don't. They probably put it in the carriage, send it back to Austria. But ultimately, her life is completely changed at the age of 14. And you can imagine that that is going to have reverberations going forward. Now, is she queen at the time? No. Louis XV is still king. But she is being prepped and prepared to be what they believe the most important person in the world. Now, I had mentioned when we were talking about Rococo about a woman named Rose Barron. And Rose Barron is considered to be kind of the first costume designer or fashion designer in a lot of ways. Started off very low. I put it in this one, definitely. But started off as a commoner, slowly worked her way up from a milliner to finding, gaining some connection in the field. and sort of working around and finally getting in touch with Marie Antoinette. And Marie Antoinette just fell in love with her and was like, "You're on, kid," and started to be what we call a modeste. I'm just writing this down. Sometimes there's an I in there too. Now, if you've been watching Bridgerton, you know what a modeste is. However, it is basically a dressmaker, a stylist. That's actually a great word to think of, because they may be a dressmaker, but ultimately they're pulling everything together. And so became the Queen's modeste, and in a sense had her ear on everything. And so ultimately she becomes incredibly influential in what is fashionable. Now, when Marie got there, we were in Franglais land. And it continues in Franglais land through pretty much her entirety. But one of the big sort of moments that happens, and I talked about this a little bit, we're going to see slides of it, is Marie said, "I need my own house. I want a house where I can go and be me." And there was already a small house called the Petit Trianon. There's the Grand Trianon, which is where the king lives, and then the Petit Trianon, which is a smaller version of that. And she was like, "It's mine. No one can come in here. Girls club only. Boys smell." And her home, her world, was basically centered around this place. She had to go to the palace. She had to go to the Grand Trianon, but this was literally like my own place. And what's really super interesting is it is grand, but it's not immense. Like we imagine Marie Antoinette having this huge palace, right? And it's not, it's very kind of comfortable and kind of small. And in fact, a lot of houses in Newport, what we call Beaux-Arts houses, are modeled on the Petit Trianon, which is a very classic inspired world, right? They kind of have a Greek feeling and a Roman feeling. And that's why sometimes this period is called neoclassic, because it's focusing on this idea of architecture, which will ultimately find its way into clothing as well. That's why it's so complicated. That's why I give it 17 different names. What makes this space incredibly important is she rejects in some ways the formality of court life and asks, in a sense, to have a space where she can wear what she wants to. And so one of the things that becomes popular within her circle is the gown à la reine, or reine. Sorry, gown à la reine. What does that mean? The robe à la reine, or the gown à la reine? The queen's dress. Well, I'm very bad at it, so don't judge me. But could there be anything different, more different than these two things right here? Yes, they're in white and they have black on them, but silhouette-wise, can you see a lot of differences between them? She wanted something that appeared to be comfortable. It appeared to be, to some degrees, simple in manner. Notice silk, damask, brocades, embroidery. What's on this one? Nothing. In fact, it's cotton. It's simple. They call it a muslin gown. And do you notice how it has kind of a quality of common man in it? It looks like a shift, or it looks like an undergarment. And remember, when we were looking at the restoration, we saw a little bit of Rococo, that kind of shepherdess ideal, that kind of play. Well, what is outside of the Petit Trianon is an area that she had created called the hameau, or the hamlet, which is to look like a Swiss village of undiscernible period. In fact, they had actors who dressed up like peasants, and they would walk around and they would get into their ganalchen and they would walk across the field pretending to be shepherdesses with pitchers and milk cows who'd been specially washed and perfumed for them. You know, they wanted the feeling of it without all the poop. And pretend for a couple minutes that they were shepherdesses, that they were pastoral lovers. And they played poor. And that's okay. Well, for us it is, not for anybody else. If we look, and we'll talk about this in a second, if we look at this gown, you can see that it looks to be a rectangle that is just gathered in at the waist, right? Can we see that? It just feels like there are rows and rows and rows. That's okay. Rows and rows and rows of gathering. And it's just this magical sash that's holding it in place. And a lot of people say, oh, she got rid of her corset. And in fact, or her stay, if you've ever read the play Marie Antoinette, which Rachel does in her classes all the time, the very first line is, I have decided to get rid of my stay. And the minute I read that, I was like, I'm not doing this play. No, it's not true. But if we look at this, and when we look at the art, can you see that that is not a natural body form? Can you see that? Whose body is that smooth, right? And if you have to imagine, if you're wearing stay all your life, you're not building up musculature the same way. So your body is going to go, right? Even though she's 15, 16, 17, and still probably in good shape. So we often understand that there is something underneath, but it gives the illusion of being something simple. If you notice the sleeves, much more romantic, right? Much softer in some ways than these straight sleeves, but we still have the engagement on, right? And then if you notice, it has this soft collar that in the lecture I call a Perot collar after the Commedia dell'arte character Perot, which is like a soft ruff. But imagine what this is supposed to feel like is it's a drawstring at the neck. Imagine a rectangle and I put a sort of cord around it and I draw that. Now I have shoulders. You may even have blouses or seam shirts that work in this manner, right? But doesn't it give a sense of kind of softness and relaxed quality? And it looks kind of peasanty, but we can tell it's not. And that's a problem. Because in the country, things are starting to go terribly wrong. And when people look at this dress or know of this dress, it starts a lot of rumors that they are very loose at the Petit Trianon. That there are these women who are having sex parties because these things, look at them, they look like they could just fall off our bodies, right? All we have to do is unsash this and poof. And it creates this sort of energy around Marie Antoinette as a scandalous woman that within the halls of the Petit Trianon, anything is happening and I don't need to know. Yeah.
And like, I don't know if you like are adverse to this name, but the chemise element, like that's why, because it was the undergarments. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I tend to use chemise or chemise gown in the next section,
Okay.
you know, but yeah, chemise al hand was one of the names that they called it because it looks like underwear. And there is something kind of, you know, as we've been proving time and time again, we like underwear, but we don't like underwear. We want to see it, but we don't want to see it. We want to pretend it's there, but if it's really there, we're in trouble. And so ultimately this becomes scandalous. And people are saying, oh, this is what loose women, and I put it in quotes up here on the board, because it's one of those words that we tend to sort of qualify people with. And instead, you know, in truth, she's 18 years old, she's 17 years old, she just wants something that she can move around in. Now, Rose Burton is thought to have done this, but it becomes scandalous. Now, little do they know that 15 minutes after Ching head gets cut off, everybody's going to be like, remember that dress? That was pretty fabulous. So it's challenging overall. Now, where Antoinette was no stranger to gossip and to problems. And there's another movie called The Affair of the Necklace, which tells of how her reputation was stained forever because of a scandal. We think about conspiracy theories today, right? That even though we know they're conspiracy theories, there's still some things that resonate that we still kind of think of, isn't that true? Is that true? I don't know if that's true. That's what also happened to her. They created this whole sort of scandal, somebody pretending to be the queen. And it was almost impossible to get people to realize that it wasn't the queen, it was somebody pretending to be them. And it, again, ruined her reputation. So, and there are a myriad of these things because, some of it was her just being a foreigner, just being, not rightly French, that we're going to hate. I'm sure none of you can imagine, any sort of immigrant issues in any country, but there was a lot of that probably influenced some of those things. Yeah.
This is like the heat of the French Revolution, right?
Well, it's building. So the challenge is France had given a great deal of their money to the Americas to support the revolution. We all know these things, hopefully. If not, I'm just reiterating this. Had given so much money to America to support through ships and arms because they hated England, right? Who doesn't hate England? Everybody at this point give all their money away to America and kind of like, we're behind you, only to kind of regret it for two reasons. First of all, it bankrupts them in a lot of ways. And two, it sort of raises the flag that revolution is possible. Now, what caused the revolution? Bread. Okay? So bread is very important in this. And I know this is very long. You're like, how is this going on? And a lot of this was in it, but it's important because it connects to fashion in some ways. 80% of a wage earner for the middle class would be spent on bread, just getting bread. What is bread? A little flour, a little water, a little yeast, maybe a little sprinkle of sugar for whimsy, right? That's all it is. But imagine the simplest thing, 80% of your wages. So imagine you make $200 a week. I know, pie in the sky dreams. You make $200 a week. What is 80% of that? Yeah. Imagine $160 for a week's worth of bread. The simplest food in the world. Now, back to Rose Barron. Rose Barron, as we were going along, thought, you know what we need to do? We need to get the hair going a little bit. Now, remember all those powdered wigs we saw, the white powdering? She starts this idea of the poof, which is taking your hair and sort of poofing it up in front. Remember about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, that was kind of a look where you'd pull it up and then you push it forward so you'd have a little bit of height. If you're still rocking it today, it's okay. It's okay. It'll come back in your lifetime, don't worry. No, it looks fabulous. Its first intention was that, to add a little height on the head. But slowly as it goes along, what it starts to do is build and build and build till we get to these huge coiffures. And when we look at the images, we're going to see hairstyles that can be upwards of 2, 3, 4 feet above the head. And as I said in the lecture, the way that we do this is through an armature, which is a wire form. Some cases it's our own hair, but other cases it's fake hair. And they paper mache it. Well, how do you make paper mache paste? Flour. And so here's another thing. They're wasting flour on hair, on fashion, on something useless. And you can see how this is all building. But it keeps going. Now, what's the other problem with flour being on our bodies for long periods of time? Because you can't take this down every day, right? You can't just Pantene it out and then do it again the next day. It's going to go bad. What does it do? Well, it's going to mold, right? Flour molds. and it's going to start to smell. And even more so, imagine laying down to go to bed. Eventually, you're going to get lice, you're going to get mice, you're going to get bugs. And in fact, little details like something that was called a lice stick used to be very popular. It was a walking stick with a little pointer on it. And if you felt something getting into your skull, you take it and you pop it in and sort of crush that little booger.
Wow.
This era was so stinky.
Yeah, but they're also not, these things are complicated. They're not, they don't have the technical advancements that we have now to dry clean and do things like that. So perfumes become popular, and the sort of illusion becomes more important sometimes than the practicality. So you can see how all these things are going to start building and building. And certainly we know that language of let them eat cake, Queen, there is no bread for the people. Well, let them eat cake, which is often sort of been disputed. Who cares? Ultimately shows that there is some separation between the royalty and the real people and the ability to understand what is necessary.
Well, that's because he didn't live in Paris, right?
Well, they lived mostly at Versailles,
Yeah.
but one of the challenges, and there are a number of really, really, really awesome books about that court and the world, is they were also in their seclusion, not allowed to know what was going on, because in many cases, and we see this too with certain situations that happen in the world. I'm sure you can't connect or understand this because it's so foreign, but sometimes people don't tell the rulers the things because they think they're going to be able to solve them, or they don't need to worry about it, right? And certainly Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette did enjoy the lavish life, and Louis was very withdrawn. Like, he didn't want to deal with anything. In fact, if you want to learn more about him, it's a very fascinating story, but he liked to he was a little homebody and wanted to play with his watches and not deal with anything. They didn't have sex or children for a very long time because of a medical condition he had, and we'll leave it at that. And eventually, they did sire children. But that was another thing. Like, because they didn't pop out babies immediately, she was a problem. It was her fault when it really was the king's fault. We've seen that before, right? That lovely misogyny. So we can see everything is against us. Ultimately, with this, along with the challenge of French life, again, imagine being in the streets in this, especially during the Reign of Terror, right? It makes you very visible that you are wealthy. And so the Anglaise, as we had talked about before, is really what becomes the predominant style. Not only because of its simplicity, but think about it, Tale of Two Cities wise. We're going to try to look English, so we're not thought of as French, because we become less of a target. Does that make sense? And we start to see this turn, even though French is going to be predominant, to all things English. And that is what is going to mold our world. But we're going to see all sorts of things that you're like, but that doesn't make sense. We're not thinking about sense, my friends. Okay? So, during the Reign of Terror, things like this make you, obviously wealthy. And so we're going to change how we look. And even in some degrees, this simple style starts to take hold as well. Because it does, if the Anglaise is way back there, but the Anglaise and that seem to match up pretty well, right? It still can be pretty formal, but can have details. And we start mixing and matching to understand what's going on. One other thing, just to mess us all up, because why not, is we start experimenting with this idea of the round gown. Okay, what is the round gown? It's taking some of the ideas we've seen before. It's taking this, the gown the Anglaise, and adding a new fashionable waistline to it. Do you notice how it's higher? Do you notice how it's sort of rounded? Remember me talking about fichu, this idea of scarves? We're going to see how that adds to the silhouette. where our emphasis is a rounded bust and a higher waist. What makes the round gown especially interesting is they're holding on to a lot of the ideas that come from this, but think, oh, you can never tell that I'm wealthy because my silhouette is so different. But it scoops up and back, and what is often in the back there are Watteau pleat, right? So it comes up very high. We tend to think of these waistlines as being square. In this case, they tend to scoop up. And we'll see lots of images, so don't panic. But that round gown, I like to think of as round in the bust, bubble in the skirt, round in the hem, round, round, round. But it goes away almost as quickly as it becomes fashionable, but it does influence everything we're seeing coming forward. Looking at men, big overview makes sense. We're going to look at slides. Looking at men, men go through a very difficult time right now because they want to look good. They're coming from the land of, you remember all those beautiful Rococo items that we saw, beautiful embroidery, sumptuous fabrics, all these things. And they're being basically told, look like an English person. Boring, boring. And they're like, but mom, I have pretty clothes. They're like, don't wear the clothes. And especially think about that. The men cannot wear the clothes because it's so easy to tell who is wealthy there. And it, again, makes you a target. This is life and death, folks. This isn't just fashion and style. This is life and death. So the idea of capturing some of the ideas of simpler lines, simpler textiles often becomes popular. But through this starts a few other things, which is this idea of the fop, the dandy, or les incroyables. Now, don't Google les incroyables because you're going to get Disney's The Incredibles. Okay? Just so you know. It's down there. But it's also misleading. So we often use the word fop. We use the word dandy in our world. What do those mean? Okay. If somebody is a dandy, okay, it certainly can imply something of not just light, but also extraneous or silly. It's often code word for homosexual.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Especially in the many years to sort of be degrading. But at the time, being a fop or being a dandy meant you were eccentric and had style. There was a little bit of like, probably gay, but not as much. It slowly turns into more of a defamatory sort of idea. And there have been, I brought a bunch of them in today, many books about dandyism. And dandyism is actually very popular right now. I can't remember the country. I want to say Uganda, but there is in the, and I say this very carefully, the poorest parts of the city, these guys who dress to the nines every single day of their lives, right? They stand out, but they're embracing it. You may follow some people on Instagram who are the same way, but it is this exceptional over-the-top styling from what we consider to be the normal for men. And especially in our society today, men are not thought, as anyone can see from the Harry Styles controversy, correct? Men should not wear certain things or else they're not quote unquote men, right? And so this sort of fights that, even though we can see ideas coming forward from Rococo, when all of a sudden things turn a little bit more staid. Huh? Yeah, well, there is. And that's okay. And we're gonna see it many times in our lives, and we fight it, but we also sometimes use it and run with it, right? But we're gonna see this combination of trying to figure out very messily how to develop clothing that is neutral. But in there are a whole bunch of people who are, if I could give the middle finger right now and it wasn't on videotape, they give the big middle finger to fashion. And there are a couple integral parts to this. The first one is the young people who have made it through the reign of terror are like, we're going to dress crazy. And most of these wealthy people have been sent overseas, right, to get out of the city. And they're doing what they call the grand tour. And they're picking up all these really crazy, cool things. It's like when you have that one friend who goes to Japan, right? And they come back and they're showing you all the cool things of Korea. Yes, of course, it's there. But they're like, we got crazy stuff. This doesn't have to match. It's all eclectic and we love it. We also have the young poor people who are going into shops or rifling through Versailles because, you know, they broke down the door and stealing all of these gorgeous things. And though they can't wear all of them, they're maybe throwing on a couple of them. And then the last thing that we sometimes have are people just trying to look fashionable that don't fall into any of those categories. And we tend to call them les incroyables, les merveilleux. These young people who are trying to change fashion, whether they're the poorest of the poor, the richest of the rich, by wearing extremes. And we're going to see lots of variations on that, but it's just like anybody you know who wears extreme fashion. It changes, but we're going to see some methodology in it. Does that make sense? So this word fop, this word dandy, even that word loose that I was using are these words that are used to sort of categorize styles, but they ultimately end up laying down philosophical ideas about the people as well. Even les incroyables, les merveilleux in certain circles is considered to be somewhat derogatory. Okay? Make sense? Ready to see some crazy?
So whatever the M word that you keep saying is,
It's all in the thing.
I know, but I want to spell it here.
Merveilleuse, M-E-R-V-E-L-I-U-S-E, I believe. Les merveilleuses. It's coming up, don't worry. Okay, let's get into slides. Do you mind hitting the lights for me, please? Thank you. Okay, for those of you at home, we are now moving out of a mode where I can even see you at all. So I want to, there we go. There we go. I want to remind you of Marie Antoinette, just where we are, where we start. We will move from this. But notice Rococo deliciousness in every way, right? We see all the hallmarks. If anything, a little bit more fit, a little bit more open, maybe even a little bit more youthful. But the one thing I want you to catch here is the hair. Can you see it starting to move, starting to pile? Right, and that's the poof. That's the movement, ultimately, of the poof. Now, when we go to Petite Trianon, this is her little corner, her bedroom, and it is inspired by this idea of neoclassicism. Now, what is neoclassicism? Pulling from ancient times. And you can see in some of these forms, things you might see in like a Greek house, like a recamier or a bed, or even Egypt or Rome. But they're trying to put it all together. When we think of the term federal period, which is the rebuilding of the United States, you know, we think of federal buildings, which look like Greek and Roman temples, right? In fact, a recent president decided that no building in Washington couldn't be built in the style of federal. And then that was quickly overturned this last week, actually. But it is a very formal style, but it's sort of inspired by the past. And we will see if we look at the gown, that gown, we'll see it change very quickly into a Greek style. Remember that word chiton? I said it from the very first day. We're going to see an influence in it. But her room is very small, her bedroom. We think of these extreme things. She wants these little tiny spaces. Yes, this is the entryway, but this is about 90% of it, and then it's just little small rooms around it. I mean, that's not super huge, right? I mean, we have Stop and Shops that are bigger than this, but even notice its scale, even though it is big, don't get me wrong, but notice how its scale sort of makes it feel smaller than it actually is, right? The windows being so big and so high, but it's only 2 floors. These smaller windows here sort of make it feel compressed. In fact, there's a whole second floor here in which there's a story that the king could only come through one sort of entryway in the basement near the kitchen. And this is what they're looking out at, the Hameau or the hamlet. And you can see it just looks like a kind of fairy tale village.
That's like Storyland.
Yeah, exactly. And if you live on Aquidneck Island, there is exactly this on Aquidneck Island in Newport. And it is called, it's called the Swiss Village. And it was built because one of the famous families had their house overlooking this valley and said, we want the same thing Marie Antoinette has. And in fact, they hired people to walk around all day to be servants, to look like Swiss villagers walking through. And today it's a horse farm, I think. Yeah. What do you do when you have money? You build your own Disneyland, right? And here you can see the Petit Trianon here, and her bedroom overlooks this area here that is the Temple of Love. So can you see the Greek sort of styling of that? So it's like Epcot, every time you turn around, there's kind of another view of another area. But it's so exciting to look at. So here we are with that Rococo, that styling. We see the powdered wig, but we can start to see it moving up and moving up. And I focus on the hair for a lot of reasons because it influences in a lot of ways the extremity. It's kind of like when we think about the 80s, we think about hair, big hair, which I see every time I go out into the world, right? But we sort of pin it on, in the 80s, we all had big hair. But here we can see how we can take that poof and sort of now it's around the head. It was in fact called the hedgehog hairdo. But here we see a very slight variation on the gown anglaise. And can you see some of the gown in that? Notice that the tatei here now is like a big open ruffle. The sleeves, everything feels a little bit more simple. It even feels like it ties across the front. Well, what's interesting about this is, sorry, I'm moving. Crap sandwich. No, I got ahead of myself, sorry. We're going to see this painting again. It is very important because this is a repaint, because she was originally painted in this and people thought it looked basically like a boudoir picture, a dirty picture, so they had to repaint it. But, like if we focus on the hair, can you see like here we are in the Restoration, kind of moving from the Restoration, sharpen that up just a bit, all the way here. And then you can see it sort of meet down on the head, but then slowly what's going to happen? It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Can you see it's like inflating almost? And notice that's like everyday hair. Wait till we get to evening hair. And then what's going to happen is that English style or that English country feeling starts to become popular. It's going to start to deflate and feel more natural, more natural, more natural. Okay? So here we go. Look at this hair. So it was very popular for parties, much like we might do for parties today, to do a poof, to do a hairstyle in this extreme form. And so what we're seeing here is an armature that then has a ship built into it. Because it's fabulous and it's fun. A lot of times these weren't just decorative, they might have sort of a connection to something that's going on, like Marie Antoinette, because they determined smallpox vaccines at this period, like the idea of how smallpox, if you ever want to know about how vaccines are developed, it's the most amazing story about the milkmaids and smallpox. But she had a wig that was in ode to the smallpox vaccine, you know, but they could have ships, they could have birds, they could have anything. And you can see how this excess, if this picture was published, would show a very different world than the poor might expect. But notice what they're wearing here, a polonaise, right? That dress that we saw before with the scooped up world. Here we see very extreme silhouettes. And you can see how this couldn't really be your own hair. You would need to have false hair tied into it and then stiffened within an inch of its life. No Gorilla Glue here, right? I try to stay current. Huh?
Is that made out of tool?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was-
all the hair from my tool. We can even see here on this image that I showed before, can you see the piling of hair in relation? Huh? Yeah, I guess, but you also have to remember, it's armature, right? You can't imagine that this is all heavy hair. There's something underneath it that all the hair is being put on. And then when the flower dries, it does become very lightweight. But yeah, I mean, you're balancing. That's the hardest part.
Probably the next muscle.
Taking place in this time when you just put the rat under the armature.
Oh my.
Yeah, anything.
It's genius.
Yeah. Here we can see the original painting that I was talking about before. Can you see the Gain à la Reine?
It's so funny because this looks so much more modest and humble
And
than the
demure,
other one.
correct.
Like,
But it is sort of frowned on because it looks like she's loose. She's just wearing her underwear. It is highly inappropriate. And we can see very simply gathered and then sashed around the waist. So how did they change it? They changed it to something much more formal. And here we can see the poof and that sort of hedgehogginess. Now we're going to move through this very quickly, but you can see how this anglaise has been sort of sashed, and now it feels like the gown à la reine, the queen's gown. Here we see an actual one. And you can see it has that Perot collar, sorry, not the detective. And then it is cinched in just as a gathering sort of thing in its simplicity. Here we can see another one, and this is starting to feel more like where we're going, right? This is feeling more like that Regency period that we talk about. But we can see it in different countries too. So this is Goya and this is Spain, but you can see a reference to it there. And notice that the chest is starting to become rounded with that fichu tucked in, and that's going to see many things. Now, within a short series of years, we're going to see the whole thing. So here we are in 1781, you know, couldn't be more Rococo. And then this starts to become popular, but it goes back, but we need to be careful. And what are we going to do? And oh, let's change the silhouette. That'll scare them. But what about this? I love this. And then boom, we're in Greek land, basically.
Chaos.
Yeah, look at how quickly that moves. We do have to remember that all these things are happening at the same time, but it is influencing how we're going to move forward. Okay? And here we can see what people kind of settle on in some ways. Can you see how there's that white gown underneath the gown à la reine? But then over it, do you see how it's almost like an anglaise put on top of it? So we get a little bit of color and a little bit of texture. And we see this often used here and there. And in front, often it is sort of a cross wrap over the body. We'll see it in many different versions. But you can see that, you know, we're going to keep the rumpiness, I guess you could say. We have that fichu along with it. And we'll start to experiment in all of these proportions. But look at this. Look how awful this is. We're trying to figure it out, though. It's okay. We'll get there. And notice also how we're going to, you know, again, we're sort of taking country and we're taking fancy in trying to figure out how we can satisfy both. And if we look at this, can you see kind of a gender neutralness to this? I mean, it's still pretty feminine, I guess you could say, but we get a sense of kind of more of a jacket and a vest or a waistcoat in there. But notice that scarf. Oh, and also the parfait contemporain, sometimes they'd be red ribbons to sort of signify the reign of terror cutting off the neck. I know. Notice these folks here, they all have that kind of emphasis up here. And we're going to slowly start to see the waistlines moving up. But notice that the white gown kind of feels like the basis of a lot of things. And so everybody who was calling her a, whore is now like, but that was kind of fabulous now that I think about it. Take a look at this. So here we're seeing a gown that has a lot of stuff happening. But do you notice that the first thing that really stands out to me, figuratively and literally, is the chest and its rounding, right? Can you see that? Notice that we see this rococo waist in there and a skirt. But do you notice how there's almost like a second waistline happening there? And really all we need to do to turn this dress into the round gown is cut out that middleman. Do you know what I mean? We're cutting that out and just taking that skirt and moving it up. And so we're ultimately left with this creeping and creeping and creeping up to the emphasis around the chest. So that we're left with, sorry, somebody else altogether. We're left with styles that will start to focus on a higher waistline. Now, these are marvelous, so we can see how this is going to influence us too. Wearing these Greek-inspired dresses, just like this, but, oh, it's not this. And can you see how everything is extreme as possible? If the dress is, high-waisted, it feels super high-waisted. It feels like it has no structures underneath it. Notice the hat, totally crazy. Look at the hat back here. You can't even see what is happening. But we can see little elements from these sort of things that we've seen before playing along. And a lot of their stuff is influenced by Greek, what they think Greek dresses are, because of that neoclassicism. And there's Marvelous, MERVEILLEUSES. And now we're seeing a little column A, a little column B, but this is all happening at the same time. That's why fashion is like, oh, this is messy, 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 messy. Or even this, look at the shoes. Remember those court shoes that we saw before with the heels and fancy? Nope, we want a poor person shoe, a slipper. Well, if you know where we're going, this is what becomes fashionable, right? And notice here, these extreme textiles that sort of draw attention to it. Look at, she chopped off all her hair. The tightest hairdo, very popular. And this is where we end up. See how this, if you didn't take this class, you might look at this and say, are they Greek? You could see the classicism in it, right? And you can see even in painting, we're going to sort of capture that as well. Oh, good, 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 good. And so here we're starting to watch a round gown happen right in front of our eyes. Can you see how the back of this starts to feel like it's popping up, starting to move up the body? And notice how this fichu, this scarf tucked into the neck, is really emphasizing the body. And it's slowly going to move up. Can you see the movement? And it's slowly going to move up. Can you see the movement? See how high it is back here? How low it is kind of here? So we're starting to see that waist seam tilt to the point that we're here. Now, again, coming on front to this, it feels like we might see in a couple hundred years, or not, a couple decades, sorry. But the key is that often they're cut incredibly high. So this is that round gown. They're cut incredibly high in the back. And can you see the Watteau pleat kind of hidden in there? It's like, Mama, I was wealthy once. We used to have these things called Watteau pleat. But it almost feels like that. But it's saying, oh, no, I'm English. I'm English, don't worry about it, right? But here's that round gown. Notice how the bust feels round. Notice how the skirt feels round. It feels round this way. Yeah,
This is like, this has nothing to do with the clothes, but they also try to pretend they weren't from there. Like if you were like really high up and you were trying to dress and like appear English,
yeah.
if someone like was talking to you, would you be like, oh yeah?
You
like-
might if you felt in danger, you know. But it's also stupid because it's a sham. Like everybody can tell you're not English because you got the silk and the embroidery, even a Watteau pleat, you
What
know.
kept those people alive? If everyone could tell that they were bullshitting it.
Yeah, well, because they're escaping to England. They're getting
Oh,
on,
yeah, they're all
they're
on
getting
that
on
line.
boats and going from Calais over to England, you know.
They got
No, they didn't. They got.
out.
So we can see those caps. We can see those caps turning into big fanciful silhouettes. I know it's a lot, and it's fabulous, and it's goofy. But if you know, again, they think, "Oh, look! How could you notice that I'm not a poor shepherdess?" Well, because you know,
You have an
you're
umbrella on your
drunk.
head.
Exactly. And this is even an illustration from the period, sort of mocking, you know, the sort of levels of extreme in the silhouette, you know. Okay. Here we see some shoes. These are French shoes, obviously 1789, which is right around the revolution, but we can see those cockades. Remember me talking about cockades? These sort of symbols that represented the movement that people had to wear. And you can see that the heels are getting smaller, right? They're starting to whittle down. Eventually, there'll be simple slippers. Now, this is the last thing we have to remember is we see an influence also with the poor. These are actual poor clothes. And most importantly, these men, which were the poor men, they were called sans culotte. Sans culotte means without breeches, because the working man often wore something that was longer, ungirdled at the knee to protect themselves. And those things we call today trousers. But we start to see breeches falling out of favor, though they will still find a way every once in a while. And trousers eventually become the more popular form. Also, the Frisian cap or the bonnet rouge, the red hat, which is directly a neoclassic idea coming from Rome when they were granted a red hat for their freedom. And notice for men, it's going to go from the extreme that we saw before, and it's slowly going to melt down to the idea of natural hair. And we never go back unless you're a judge. So here we are, right? Rococo, deliciousness. The pieces are going to stay the same, but they're going to have a different story. And remember when I told you that at the end, that collar was so important, we start to see that collar moving up. It's going to play a role in everything we see from now on, because if we look at this, it gets to the point that it's so high that eventually it's going to fold over. And when it folds over, we start this very complicated idea of revers and lapels. And so we can see here, notice how the coat really starts to feel more like a jacket. Even though it has the tails, everything is being pulled out of it. No skirting whatsoever. Almost feeling like it's just moving into tails. We can tell this is later, even though this is American. Higher waist, right? The waistcoat. And to the point that we get to a jacket, this justacorps will really turn into a suit jacket. Now, we can see that this person is probably influenced by Les Incroyables, right? That little leopard print vest. Look at me, I'm a little fabulous here, right? And the striped stockings. But notice up here that jacket is starting to form what we might call today a lapel or collar and revers. They're experimenting and playing with all these things. What are we looking at here? A soldier, right? We understand the idea of the red coats. So that red coat is going to align you with England, especially if you're French or American and want to hide. But it's also going to give way to the styling of country wear, which we call today pinks, which is hunting wear. So if you've ever seen people, you've ever seen the movie Name, say, or Anti-Name, they go hunting on a fox hunt, they all wear red jackets that we call pinks. So the idea of a red sporting jacket becomes very popular. And also notice that this one buttons differently. Remember before they were sort of spread out. Now what are we doing? We're crossing over into that form of double-breastedness. But we can't, if we had that, it wouldn't show off our waistcoat underneath. It wouldn't show off our very super tight breeches. So what do? We cut out the front of it, right? So that we could show off as much as possible. We could see where this is gonna go, my friends. We can even see here, yeah, look at how extreme that is. Here's a little super secret for you. If you see stripes, you have a really good chance that we're in this era. You're gonna see stripes kind of permeating in everything. And look at this crazy sleeve. Like it almost looks like it's twisted, right? But you can see sort of the extremity. Notice even how the cravat, the jabot, kind of mirrors the woman's roundness up here. We've split open because we want to show as much fancy as we can. But you can't tell that I'm fancy because I'm just following fashion. We can even see extremity in men with sometimes wigs. Again, this is what's called les incroyables in some ways, but you can tell, obviously, it is an upper class person. Now, I also mentioned this in the lecture, the incroyables also were called macaroni. And so if you listen to Yankee Doodle, that's where that term Yankee, stuck a feather in his cap and called him macaroni, meant a well-dressed person. Now, obviously, that's Italian, and that informs us that these styles may have come from Italy as well, this kind of extremity. Here we see that kind of country look that sort of eventually will signify hunting wear, right? And here we can see an incroyable from about 1792. Now, they didn't have cameras back then. This is probably doing one of the worst things you could possibly do, which is take historical costume and put it on your body. And this is these are actual clothes from the period. And somebody decided that they were going to put it on their body and take a picture. But you can see the double-breastedness here. Notice the collars all sort of flipping around here. Notice instead of breeches, we're kind of getting into trousers. Stripe, 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 stripe. That certainly helps tell. And it's weird looking, right? It's kind of crazy. We're going to see a couple other things. But we see the stripes, so that tells us. But can you see how that collar got so high, all it could do was fall down? And notice how the collar and the revere, they're not joined yet. We can't figure that out. Like see here on my waistcoat, I have an upper collar in here, and we would call this whole thing the lapels. Can you see how these two are still separate? We'll get there, I promise you. And we're cutting out the front so we can show off more underneath. Here we see Robespierre, who was in charge of the Reign of Terror. And we can see all the stripes, Because we see the stripes here, the red, blue, and white stripes. We see the stripe in the jacket. We see the stripe in the waistcoat. But the one mistake in painting, can you notice how the stripes go this way? And then notice how they come across on this one? I don't think that was probably what it really looked like. I don't know, maybe it was.
That's messing with some green
I know.
stuff.
But this is where we end up. This is where it ultimately finds itself, completely modeled on English country clothing. And when we kind of hit this point, I keep saying menswear is changing, menswear is changing. Well, this is kind of it, because we start to recede completely into neutrals, just the basics, please. And the idea of being flamboyant, being a dandy, being a fop only comes out randomly. And we have to be really careful. But you can see how that is going to influence us. Okay? We made it with 5 minutes to spare. 5 minutes to spare. Okay, those of you who are at home, any problems, questions, concerns, challenges?
No, everything looks great.
Okay. So as we're thinking, do you mind hitting the lights? Oh, I'm gonna take these 5 minutes. I'm gonna take these are still long. No. But the thing I want you to remember, because I know it's kind of crazy, is don't try to put them in order. Don't try to make sense of the senseless, because it is just crazy time. But try to remember those individual silhouettes, the Ganohan. Try to remember how they influence and inform how we're moving forward. Now, for those of you here in the room, you notice that I picked up something quite a while ago and have been playing with it for about the past hour. Now, I don't generally talk about these things. For those of you at home, it's the fan. I should turn on can I turn on? There we go. I'm going to turn on the camera so you can see what I've been doing for the past half an hour, but is my fan. Now, did you notice that it was an extension of my hand the entirety? Right? I knew where it was at all times. I used it as I needed to use it, but ultimately it's not what I often see in plays where it's
Aggressive flapping.
exactly. In fact, it was considered to be kind of bad if you did do
It's
this.
supposed to be warm.
Yes, exactly. Its intention was it was another place to hot glue decoration on, right? And to show your status based on the type of it. But why I picked it up and why I wanted to use it is because eventually it should be part of your hand that you don't even notice it, that I can use it to point, I could use it to gesture. If I did get a little hot, I could hide myself behind it. I could do all sorts of things, but it's not an obvious thing. And we have to think about all the pieces that make up this world and how they're not obvious to them. They want to show them off. They want them to be pretty, but they're part of their world. The same way that your earbuds are part of your world and you probably don't even think about them. But if we were 20 years back, or maybe even 30 years in the future, it'd be like, how could they even stand something touching their ears for that long? Right? So keep that in mind, and that's why I do little stupid things like this every once in a while, because it subconsciously gets it into your head about what these things do. When we get into the Victorian era, deeper, we even have more of a story about how these things were used, that they were used for secret code and to develop conversations with each other. Okay. So lastly, if you're interested in this idea of dandyism, I brought 2 books here today that you can look up because I think they're just incredible books. This one was from an exhibit at the RISD Museum. And if you had a chance, I'll show it here. Called Artist Rebel Dandy. And it was all like contemporary clothes, but put in the context of like Les Incroyables or like these extreme wearings. And you could see like some of the textiles that were in it that were really incredible. But also from Los Angeles Museum. Yes. A book called Raining Men, which I think is hysterical. I know. But even that's a joke, because Raining Man is the gayest song that was ever written. Okay. I can say that. But think about that. It sort of is in there because raining, meaning like one who reigns, but then raining men tying it to, so there is this kind of subtext of if you dress fancy, there's kind of a little bit of a gay in you, and that's okay. But these are 2 really awesome books that show sort of the extremity of wear of both men and dandies. Okay? Awesome. I hope you found today fun. Again, take a look at the information that's there. If you're interested in doing the movie paper, read the information there, and then we can talk about that further. Okay? Awesome. I will see you all on Tuesday. Thank you for those of you who are at home. Now I get to cry for a little while.
Thank you, David. Have a
No.
nice day.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, David.